Welcome back to History and Haven. Tonight, begin with an image, and hold it lightly, the way you would hold something fragile in the dark. A courtroom, a judge, a crowd of witnesses who would rather be anywhere else. And at the center of it, an accused man who will not rise when his name is called, who will not lift his hand to swear, who will not answer a single question put to him, because that hand has been still for the better part of a year. He is dead. Everyone breathing in that room knows he is dead, and the trial begins anyway. That is where we are going tonight. Into the cold middle of winter, in the year 897, when the living master of the Roman Church summoned a dead master of the Roman Church to answer for himself, and then stood waiting, in complete and terrible seriousness, for the corpse to speak. Before we set out, if these long, slow stories are something you genuinely enjoy, a like and a subscribe helps them find the people who need them. And, if you feel like it, leave your town and your local time in the comments. It lets the other sleepless travellers know they are not alone in the dark, that somewhere another lamp is burning, and someone else is awake and listening beside you. Now settle. Let your shoulders come down from where they have been holding themselves all day. Let the breath go long and easy. There is nothing you need to do for the next while, but drift along beside a tired old narrator into the tangled and rather scandalous life of a man called Pope Stephen VI, and the dead pope he could not bring himself to leave in peace. The room was in the Lateran, the sprawling papal complex on the edge of Rome, a building old by then and draughty and patched over so many times that the patches had patches, which is how most things in Rome were in those years. Lamps and candles laid a thin yellow light across the faces of bishops and clergy who had been summoned, and who understood perfectly well that summonses of this kind are not the sort one declines. And in the middle of the room, seated in a chair, was the defendant. His name had been Formosus. He had been Pope himself, the man who held the throne immediately before the quarrel that brought everyone here. He had died quietly and naturally, an old man of nearly 70, laid to rest with all the honours owed him in St. Peter's. He had simply not been permitted to stay there. On the order of the new pope, men had gone out to the tomb, broken it open, and lifted the body from its place. They had dressed it again in the full vestments of the office, the heavy robes, the pallium, every woven symbol of papal authority, and carried him back through the city to the chair where any accused churchman would sit. Behind the body, crouched low and out of sight, a young deacon had been placed, whose task was to speak aloud in the dead man's voice whenever the judges required an answer. It was, in its way, the worst job in Rome that season, and history did not trouble itself to write down his name. At the front of the hall stood Stephen, very much alive, very much in command, and very much beside himself with rage. He was not a calm official presiding over a dull point of law. By the accounts that survive, he shouted. He leaned toward the silent figure and demanded to know how it had dared reach for the papacy, how it had broken the sacred laws of the church, how it had abandoned the place that was rightfully its own. The corpse said nothing. The frightened deacon murmured denials on its behalf, and the bishops watched, because in that season, watching was a great deal safer than not watching. The event has come down to us under a grim Latin name. Some called it the Synodus Horrenda, the horrible synod. Most people now simply call it the Cadaver Synod, the Council of the Corpse. It belongs to that small, strange category of historical moments that sound invented. But the bones of it are real. It happened. It was set down by men alive at the time, and by churchmen who came shortly after, men profoundly embarrassed by the whole affair, who would have been delighted to deny it if only they could. And here is something worth carrying with you as we begin. We tend to picture the medieval church as one long, unbroken calm, robed figures moving in candlelit order down the centuries. These particular years were nothing of the kind. They were loud and violent and desperately political. Popes were made and unmade by armies and feuding families. A man could hold the most sacred office in Western Christendom and be dead in a cell within the year. The throne of St. Peter was, in this era, one of the most dangerous chairs a person could be invited to sit in. There is even a small, almost comic uncertainty that trails after Stephen to this day. Because of an old confusion in the counting of earlier popes who shared his name, scholars still cannot entirely agree whether to call him Stephen VI or Stephen VII. The man who staged the most shocking trial in the history of the papacy cannot be reliably numbered. It is a peculiar sort of fame, to be remembered chiefly for a corpse and a bookkeeping error. To understand how an educated and otherwise sane man came to drag his dead predecessor into a courtroom, we cannot begin with the trial. We have to step back, far back. We have to see the broken world that made such a thing possible, and the city of Rome as it truly was, a shrunken little life rattling around inside enormous ruins. We have to understand the shattered empire that left Italy with no strong hand to steady it. We have to meet the dead man while he was still alive and ambitious and climbing, and follow the long quarrel that hardened old grudges into open war. And we have to meet the fierce, unforgiving family who wanted revenge, and who found in Stephen exactly the instrument they were looking for. We will follow all of it slowly, the way you walk a path you are in no hurry to reach the end of. The dead pope in the chair has all the time in the world, and for the next little while, so do you. So let the lamps in that draughty hall burn low in your imagination. Let Stephen's furious voice fade back into the quiet. We will return to that room before the night is out. But first we step outside, into the streets of a strange and weary city, in a strange and weary century, and begin where the story properly begins. If you had walked into Rome in the closing years of the 9th century, you would have felt it before you understood it. Something heavy in the air, a silence that did not suit so famous a name. This was the city that had once governed the known world. At its height, perhaps 1 million people had pressed inside its walls. By the time of our story, that number had fallen nearer to 30,000, and possibly fewer. Whole districts stood empty. The walls were still there, mile upon mile of brick raised centuries earlier by the Emperor Aurelian, still tracing the long line of the old sprawl. But those walls now enclosed a great deal more ground than there were people to fill. Inside them lay long, open stretches of nothing much at all. Vineyards and kitchen gardens grew up through collapsed masonry, and sheep and cattle cropped the grass in places where senators had once argued points of law and crowds had roared themselves hoarse. The Forum, the old beating heart of Roman public life, had sunk into a half-buried field, and in later centuries people would call a part of it the Campo Vaccino, the cow pasture. There is a whole history in that name, and none of it is kind. The great monuments still loomed. The Colosseum stood scarred and partly stripped, absurdly vast for the handful of people living in its shadow. The aqueducts that had once carried water across the hills had mostly been cut or shattered in earlier wars, so the shrunken city drew close to the Tiber and drank from the river instead. Marble was quietly carried off from old temples and older tombs, some of it burned in kilns into lime for mortar, some slotted into new walls where it did not quite belong. The Romans of that age lived like tenants in a mansion built by ancestors they could no longer understand, keeping a few rooms warm and letting the rest go softly to ruin. And yet Rome was not dead. Poorer, smaller, quieter, but still one of the most important places in Europe, for one reason above all. It was the city of St. Peter. It held the tombs of the apostles. It was the seat of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, who claimed a particular authority over the whole Western Church. Pilgrims still came, some from astonishing distances, walking south over the Alps and down the long roads of Italy to pray at the holy places and to look, once in their lives, upon the relics. What they left in offerings helped keep the city breathing. The Pope was not only a man of prayer here, he was, in the plainest practical sense, lord of the city and of a wide band of country around it. Centuries of gifts and grants and quiet expansion had left the papacy holding lands across central Italy, the territories we call the Papal States. The Pope gathered revenues, appointed officials, kept the walls patched and the working churches lit. He fed the poor when the harvests failed and tried to hold order among a population that was proud, hungry, and very easily stirred. To rule Rome was to wear two hats at once, shepherd of souls and manager of a struggling town. That double role explains nearly everything that follows. Because the papacy commanded wealth and land and prestige, it became a prize. The powerful families of Rome looked at the throne of St. Peter and saw not only a holy office, but a steady source of income and influence for their sons. Rulers beyond the mountains looked at it and saw a maker of crowns, the one man who could set the imperial diadem on a king's head and name him heir to the Caesars. A pope's blessing could turn a conqueror into a lawful sovereign. A pope's curse could set a throne trembling. Whoever held the pope held a lever long enough to move the Western world. The city wore these tensions in its stones. Beside the crumbling pagan temples rose newer churches, some grand and some very plain, glittering with mosaic in the lamplight. The clergy formed a large and busy class of their own, from humble priests in small parishes up to the cardinal bishops and deacons who ran the Pope's administration. Around them clustered the aristocratic houses, men with private strongholds tucked among the ruins, who kept armed followers and could, when it suited them, turn a street into a battlefield before the bells had finished ringing. For ordinary people, life moved to older rhythms. Bells marked the hours. Markets opened near the water. Boats came up the Tiber with grain and goods. In the narrow lanes, craftsmen worked leather and metal. Bakers fired their ovens in the dark before dawn, and water sellers carried jars up from the river to anyone who could pay. Sickness travelled easily through those cramped quarters, and the river that gave them life flooded with terrible regularity, swallowing the low neighbourhoods and reminding everybody how loose their grip on the place really was. Above all, Rome lived with a peculiar awareness of its own past. Wherever people looked, they met evidence of a greatness they could not match. Inscriptions they could no longer read. Statues of emperors whose names had slipped away. Engineering nobody alive knew how to repeat. It bred a mood half pride and half melancholy, the feeling of being small caretakers of something enormous. They knew they were the heirs of glory, and they knew, somewhere beneath the knowing, that the glory had gone. Into this setting, the men of our story were born. This was the air they breathed, these the half-empty streets they walked, the patched churches where they prayed, the crumbling palaces where they schemed. The grandeur was a memory. The ambition was entirely present, and the stakes for anyone reaching upward here were as high as anywhere on earth. To understand why that reach became so violent, we have to go beyond the walls, beyond Italy altogether. The storm that broke over Rome did not begin in Rome. It began in the slow unravelling of a dream one man had held 100 years before. Travel back then to a brighter morning. Christmas Day in the year 800 in the old Basilica of St. Peter's. A pope named Leo III lifted a crown and set it on the head of a Frankish king named Charles, the man we remember as Charlemagne, and declared him emperor, reviving a Western imperial title that had stood empty for centuries. Historians still argue about that moment, and probably always will, over whether Charlemagne walked into that church expecting it, or whether the Pope caught him by surprise and bound him to Rome before he could think better of it. For a while it seemed order had come back to the West. Charlemagne ruled an immense realm across what is now France and Germany, the Low Countries, and much of Italy. He was real power, a conqueror and a builder, a man who gathered scholars around him and tried to haul learning out of its long decline. He protected the Pope. He kept the roads more or less passable. He gave Europe a centre it had gone generations without, and he gave the papacy a partner strong enough to matter. But an empire assembled around one extraordinary man rarely outlasts him. Charlemagne died in 814. His son, Louis the Pious, held the inheritance together for a time, though the strain showed, and once Louis was gone, his own quarrelling sons pulled the whole thing to pieces between them. In 843, by a famous agreement we call the Treaty of Verdun, the empire was carved into 3 portions, one for each of 3 brothers. The western share would slowly harden into France, the eastern into Germany, and a long, awkward middle strip, including northern Italy, went to the eldest, who kept the imperial title and commanded far less than his grandfather ever had. Historians still turn that treaty over, some seeing the deliberate partition of a continent, others only 3 tired brothers dividing an estate with no idea what they had set in motion. From that first division, the cracks kept spreading. Each portion was split again among heirs. The imperial crown passed from hand to hand, occasionally to a capable man, more often to a weak or short-lived one. With every generation, the centre grew fainter, and the edges grew stronger. Dukes and counts and bishops who had once answered to an emperor began, quietly, to answer only to themselves. The great machine Charlemagne had built was coming apart, bolt by bolt, and no hand was left steady enough to hold it. Italy came undone in its own particular fashion. The north, the old Lombard kingdom the Franks had swallowed, turned into a wrestling ground for rival claimants to the crown of Italy and to the imperial title beyond it. The powerful Italian houses, the dukes and margraves of the great regions, fought one another and courted whichever distant king might lend weight to their ambitions. No voice remained whose words simply settled a dispute. There was only a shifting contest of strong men, each watching the others, each waiting. Into that disorder came dangers from outside as well. From the sea and the south came Muslim raiders, the Saracens of the chronicles, who struck coastal towns, emptied monasteries, and at one dreadful moment in the 9th century came up to Rome itself and plundered the great basilicas standing outside the walls, including the ground around St. Peter's. The shock ran so deep that a later pope raised a new fortified wall around the Vatican Quarter, an enclosure still remembered by his name, and Rome learned that even the tomb of the apostle was not beyond reach. From the north and east in time came other riders, the Magyars out of Hungary, who would eventually push far down into Italy. The old Roman world had kept such visitors at arm's length. Now they came more or less as they pleased. This is the broken stage on which our story plays. The Carolingian dream of one Christian empire under one emperor and one pope had rotted into a patchwork of competing powers, and in that patchwork the papacy stood strangely exposed. The Pope still held the right to crown an emperor, which made him immensely valuable, but he no longer had one strong emperor standing over him as protector. He had instead a ring of rival lords, each wanting that crown, each understanding exactly which man could hand it over. Think of the temptation. Control the Pope, and you control the crown. Install your own candidate on the throne of St. Peter, have yourself anointed emperor, and your rivals become footnotes. And if the Pope leaned the wrong way, if he set that diadem on your enemy's head instead of yours, he was no longer a shepherd. He was an obstacle, and obstacles are dealt with by whatever lies nearest to hand. So the papacy was pulled in every direction at once. A pope had to weigh this lord against that one, guess which would win the next war, and stake the prestige of the church on his guess. Guessing wrong could be fatal. Backing a claimant who then lost might mean exile, or a cell, or something quieter and worse. And not only for the pope, but for every man who had risen alongside him. Because these struggles cut so deep, the hatreds they bred did not expire. They were inherited, nursed, kept warm long after the original quarrel should have gone cold in the ground. Which is why, when we come at last to the sight of one pope shouting into the face of another pope's corpse, we should not mistake it for madness arriving out of nowhere. It is the fruit of this whole broken age, ripened slowly, the moment when the feuds of a collapsing empire reached down past the living and into the grave itself. The men of Rome were not crueler or stranger than other people. They were caught inside a system that had lost its centre, where the highest prizes were guarded by the lowest violence, and where yesterday's ally became today's executioner between one morning and the next. To feel the full weight of that, we need to look at the throne itself, at how a man actually became pope in those years, and at how dangerous the road to that holy chair had grown. We tend to imagine the choosing of a pope as something orderly and hushed, cardinals behind locked doors, ballots folded in silence, a thread of smoke telling the world a decision has been made. None of that machinery existed yet in the 9th century. A papal election was a far untidier business, and in this era it had drifted close to a contest of sheer force. In theory it was simple. The pope was chosen by the clergy and people of Rome. The leading churchmen, the cardinal priests and deacons, with the bishops of the nearby towns, would gather and settle on a worthy man, and the people gave their approval by acclamation, a roar of agreement rolling through the streets. In earlier, calmer centuries, the emperor or his representative had often confirmed the choice, a small ceremony of partnership between church and crown. It was meant to be a joining of the holy and the public, a leader raised up by God's ministers and the voice of the city together. In practice, by the time of our story, the process had become a lever that powerful hands fought over. The great families of Rome, with their private soldiers and long webs of clients, had worked out that whoever dominated an election could seat a friend, a cousin, or a puppet on the throne. Rulers beyond the mountains learned the same lesson and pressed candidates of their own. The clergy who cast the votes stood in the middle, pressured, bribed, or simply frightened. And the acclamation of the people, that ancient roar of consent, could be arranged, purchased, or staged outright by whichever faction held the upper hand that week. So becoming pope had rather less to do with holiness than with timing, alliances, and raw strength. A candidate needed backers with money and swords. He needed to be tolerable to whichever lord was strongest that season. And he needed luck, because the ground could shift overnight. A man raised up by one faction might find within months that a rival faction held the city, that his protectors had fled or fallen, and that everything holding him upright had quietly been removed. Nor did the danger end at the enthronement. A pope in this age lived with a shadow at his shoulder. He could be chased out of Rome by an angry crowd or a hostile army, seized by enemies and shut away, driven over the Alps to beg shelter from a foreign king. In the worst cases, he could be maimed or killed. The person of the Pope, which by every rule of the faith should have been untouchable, was in practice horribly exposed to the ordinary violence of the century. This very century would see more than one pope come to a brutal end at the hands of men who had once knelt to him. There is a darker pattern still, one that historians have given a memorable name, though it belongs chiefly to the decades just after our story. They speak of an age when a handful of Roman noble families, one great house above all, made and unmade popes almost at will, passing the throne of St. Peter among their favourites as though it were family property. Some writers called it the rule of the harlots, Others prefer the gentler Latin, the dark century. The seeds were already in the soil in the years we are walking through. The papacy was sliding toward a time when it would serve less as a lamp for Christendom than as a trophy in a long aristocratic brawl. To climb in such a world, a churchman had to be far more than devout. He had to be a politician, a survivor, a reader of weather. He had to know which families were rising and which were quietly rotting, which king beyond the mountains might come marching next, which of his brother clergy could be trusted, and which would sell him for a better chair. Loyalty existed, it was simply fragile. A man might serve one pope faithfully for years, then turn on that pope's memory the moment the city changed hands. The same bishops who praised a ruler in life would condemn him in death, for no deeper reason than that the wind had shifted. And here we reach the taproot of the Cadaver Synod. The trial of a dead pope was monstrous, certainly, but monstrous in a way that grew naturally out of this ground. In a world where popes were the creatures of factions, a pope's acts were never purely spiritual. His appointments, his ordinations, his coronations were political property. So if one faction triumphed and wished to wipe out the achievements of a rival's pope, every one of those acts became a target. His ordinations could be challenged. The careers of the men he had lifted up could be pulled apart, thread by thread. And if you wanted to undo all of it at a single stroke, there was one clean and devastating method. You declared that he had never lawfully been pope at all. That, in the coldest political terms, is what the trial of the corpse was built to accomplish. It was not about the soul of the dead man. It was about the living men whose positions rested on him, and the other living men who wanted those positions. Condemn the dead pope, pronounce his reign unlawful, and in one afternoon you could sweep away everyone he had raised and reward everyone he had shut out. There was a brutal logic beneath the spectacle in that Lateran hall, the logic of a struggle for power that acknowledged no boundary at all, not even the boundary of death. But logic, however cold, still needs hands to carry it out. It needs a victim with a long and complicated history, full of choices that can be turned against him. And it needs men carrying old wounds who have waited a long while for their moment. So it is time to meet the dead man while he was still walking and breathing and climbing. Long before he was a body in a chair, Formosus was a young and gifted churchman with a future that looked entirely bright. We do not know the year of his birth, only that he came into the world early in the 9th century, in or near Rome, and that the records pick him up already in motion, rising through the clergy at a time when ability and energy could still carry a capable man a long way. His name is worth pausing on. Formosus, in Latin, means handsome or well-formed. Whether it described his face or only his bearing we cannot say, but it followed him through a remarkable career, and then, cruelly, into a grim afterlife. He appears clearly in the records around the middle of the century, already a man of standing, when he was made Bishop of Porto, one of the small but weighty sees in the ring of towns around Rome. These suburban bishops, the cardinal bishops as people were beginning to call them, sat close to the warm centre of papal power. They advised the Pope, took their places in the great ceremonies, and could be sent on the most delicate errands the Church had to offer. To hold such a post while still young meant that powerful men had watched Formosus and decided he was made for something larger. It came soon enough. In those years, the Church was pressing outward beyond the old Christian heartlands, reaching for peoples not yet won. Away to the northeast lay the kingdom of the Bulgars, a fierce and rising power whose ruler, Boris I, was weighing the greatest decision of his life: whether to bring his people into the Christian fold, and if so, whether to turn west toward Rome or east toward Constantinople. This was no small question. Whichever church took the Bulgars would gain enormous sway over an entire nation, and the rivalry between Rome and Constantinople over such conversions was old and bitter. Boris understood his own value perfectly and let both sides court him for years, which historians still read two ways: as the honest wavering of a man in search of truth, or as one of the shrewdest pieces of bargaining any medieval king ever managed. Formosus was sent into Bulgaria as a representative of the Pope, and there he made an impression that outlasted him. He worked among the Bulgars with skill and evident devotion, and the result was extraordinary. Boris came to admire him so deeply that he wrote to Rome asking that Formosus be made Archbishop of the Bulgarians, head of their whole new church. It is hard to overstate the compliment. Here was a foreign king with the pick of Christendom's clergy, and yet the request could not be granted, because it collided with one of the oldest and most jealously guarded rules of the Church, and with the quiet envy of Formosus's own colleagues. The ancient law held that a bishop was wedded to his diocese, bound to the see where he had been consecrated, as a husband is bound to a wife, and was not to abandon it for another. A bishop of Porto could not simply become a bishop of the Bulgarians. To strict eyes, moving a man from a smaller post to a grander one looked a great deal like ambition wearing the robes of service. Pope Nicholas I refused, and Formosus went back to the duties he had left. Boris, denied the man he wanted, would in time turn his gaze eastward instead, and the Bulgarian Church would grow up in the shadow of Constantinople rather than Rome. One small refusal, quietly rearranging the map of a continent. Still, the episode showed something about the man. He was able, persuasive, trusted with the heaviest tasks the papacy had to give. He had the affection of foreign kings and the attention of popes. He was, in other words, exactly the sort of churchman who rises quickly, and exactly the sort who gathers enemies on the way up. For every patron who admired his gifts, there was a rival who resented them, and in the narrow, competitive world of the Roman clergy, resentment had a very long memory. In the years that followed, he went on serving in weighty roles, carrying out missions, lending his authority to delicate affairs, a fixture of the papal court whose opinion changed the temperature of a room. And as the great struggles of the age unfolded, the contests over the imperial crown, the feuds between Roman factions, the endless manoeuvring between Rome and the Frankish kingdoms, Formosus was drawn deeper into the currents swirling round the throne of St. Peter. A man that visible could not stand aside, however much he might have wished to. He had to choose, and in such a time, choosing was always dangerous. It is worth pausing to look at the shape of his life so far. He was not a scheming villain, whatever his enemies would later insist. He was a gifted servant of the Church who had earned real distinction through real work, in the missions, in the councils, in the daily grind of a complicated office. The admiration of King Boris had not been purchased, it had been won. The trust successive popes placed in him was no accident either, but the slow accumulation of competence, year upon year. Had his story closed in his middle age, he would be remembered today, if at all, as a capable and rather successful bishop of the early medieval church. But his story did not close there. The very qualities that had lifted him, the ambition, the prominence, the nearness to power, were about to drag him down. A new pope was coming to the throne who would look at Formosus and see not a valued servant, but a rival. In a world where popes were made by factions, where yesterday's honour could be filed as today's accusation, a man as visible as Formosus made a tempting target. The next stretch of his life is not a story of rising, it is a story of falling, of accusation and flight, of excommunication and exile, of a proud and accomplished man cast down and set wandering. To understand how his body came to be seated in that chair, we have to understand how the living man was stripped of everything, branded a traitor to his own church, and driven out of the city he loved. The grudges that killed him after his death were planted while his heart was still beating. The turning point came with the rise of a new and forceful pope, John VIII, who took the throne in the early 870s. John was strong-willed, deeply entangled in the violent politics of Italy, and quick to see enemies among the ambitious churchmen around him. In the close air of his reign, the prominence that had served Formosus so well curdled into a liability. That he was admired, capable, and well-connected made him, to a suspicious pope, a man worth watching. And a man worth watching is a short step from a man worth removing. The break, when it came, was abrupt. At some point in the late 870s, Formosus left Rome without the Pope's permission, trailing a storm of accusations behind him. The reasons are tangled, and the sources, written by partisans on both sides, do not agree. But the political weather is clear enough. Italy was convulsed by struggles over the imperial succession, and factions among the clergy and nobility backed different men. Formosus seems to have been tied to a faction John came to regard as hostile, and when the Pope moved against his opponents, Formosus ran rather than stand and answer. Historians still argue over that flight, whether it was the reflex of a guilty conspirator or the good sense of a man who knew how such trials ended. John responded with the full weight of his office. He summoned Formosus back to answer the charges, and when the bishop did not appear, the Pope had him condemned in a Roman synod. The accusations piled up were grave. He was charged with deserting his diocese, with conspiring against the Pope and against the interests of Rome, with reaching for power by improper means, with a scattering of other offences against the good order of the Church. He was excommunicated, cut off from the communion of the faithful, and stripped of his rank. For a man who had stood so high, it was a staggering distance to fall. So Formosus became a fugitive, a disgraced and excommunicated bishop, wandering beyond the reach of the Pope who had condemned him, sheltering in regions Rome did not firmly control, living in the cold limbo of a churchman declared an outcast by the institution he had given his life to. The trusted envoy to kings, the man a foreign nation had asked for by name, now had no see, no standing, no certain future, and nothing to hold but the knowledge that the age had turned its face from him. But the politics of that age never stayed fixed for long, which was its curse and, occasionally, its mercy. In time, John softened, or found it useful to appear to soften, and Formosus was permitted to make his peace. The terms were humiliating. By the accounts that survive, he was required to give up his episcopal office altogether, and to promise that he would never return to Rome or reach again for the position he had lost. He came back into the communion of the faithful, then, but only as a chastened and reduced figure. A former bishop living quietly at the edge of things, his ambitions handed in at the door, at least on parchment. Then the wheel turned again, as it always did. John VIII came to a violent end, murdered by the grim tradition that has come down to us, by men of his own circle, poisoned and then beaten when the poison worked too slowly. Nothing says more about the papal throne of those years than the manner of that death. With John gone, the faction that had broken Formosus lost the champion holding it together. New popes came and went, and the harsh sentences of the past began quietly to be looked at again. Under a pope named Marinus I, Formosus was restored. The excommunication was lifted entirely. His rank as Bishop of Porto was handed back, and he was welcomed again into the life of the Roman Church that had cast him out. Hold on to that restoration, because it is the thread that runs all the way to the chair in the Lateran hall. When his enemies finally dragged his body into court, their central argument would reach back precisely to this moment. They would say that a man who had once renounced his bishopric and sworn never to resume it had sinned gravely by taking up episcopal office again, and more gravely still by climbing afterward to the papacy. In their telling, every step of his recovery was unlawful, a chain of broken oaths stretching from his exile to his throne. The mercy that gave him his life back would be turned, after his death, into proof of his guilt. For the moment, though, he was a free and honoured man again, and his toughness showed itself once more. He took his old place among the leading churchmen of Rome and returned to the great affairs of the Church and the endless contests of Italian politics. The disgrace had not finished him. If anything, it added something, a reputation as a man not easily put down, who could absorb the worst this savage age could throw and still walk back into the room. In a world of short and brutal careers, simply lasting was a kind of victory, and he was not finished climbing. That he had been cast down and lifted up again, that he had felt both papal fury and papal mercy, made him a known quantity, a senior man with an unsentimental grasp of how power in Rome actually worked. So when the throne of St. Peter next stood empty, the eyes of the city turned, among others, toward this seasoned and unbreakable Bishop of Porto. The man once driven out as an excommunicate was about to be considered for the highest office in the Western Church. There is a quiet irony in it. The same restless ambition his enemies condemned was almost certainly the thing that kept him alive and relevant through decades of danger. He did not withdraw into obscurity when he had every reason to. He stayed in the arena, and the arena, in the end, would crown him and destroy him with the same hand. In the year 891, after a long life of service and disgrace and recovery, Formosus reached the summit. He was elected pope. Think of the distance travelled. The bishop who had been excommunicated and exiled, made to surrender his office and swear he would never come back to Rome, now sat on the throne of St. Peter as supreme head of the Western Church. It was an extraordinary outcome for a career that had nearly ended in a ditch, and it says a great deal about his ability and his sheer durability that he arrived there at all. But the chair he settled into was perched over a pit. The great question of the age, who should wear the imperial crown and stand as protector of Italy and the Church, was bitterly unsettled, and the Pope sat at the exact centre of it. To be Pope in those years was to be the maker of kings, and a maker of kings is loved by the man he crowns, and quietly hated by every man he passes over. Formosus would learn that to the bottom, and his body would go on paying for it long after his soul had gone. The strongest force in Italy at the moment of his election was the House of Spoleto. That duchy in central Italy had bred ambitious, warlike lords who reached first for the crown of Italy and then for the imperial title beyond it. Guy of Spoleto, whom the Italians called Guido, had made himself king of Italy and been crowned emperor, and he meant to found a dynasty that would last. He and his family expected the Pope to support them, bless their rule, and confirm their claims without fuss. At first, with their armies close and their patience thin, Formosus did exactly that. He crowned Guy as emperor. Later he crowned Guy's young son, Lambert, as co-emperor beside his father. To the House of Spoleto, this was no favour. It was the plain recognition of a right they already possessed. But Formosus was not a contented partner. Like a good many in Rome, he feared how large the Spoletans were growing. A strong emperor seated close at hand in Italy, with the men and the will to dominate the city, was a frightening prospect for a pope who valued his independence and the freedom of the Church. Spoleto was too near, too strong, and too hungry. To live under their hand was to risk becoming their instrument, then their servant, then nothing at all. So Formosus, the survivor, the reader of weather, began looking elsewhere for a counterweight. Someone powerful enough to matter. Someone far enough away to be useful without being suffocating. His gaze went north, over the Alps, and settled on the East Frankish king, Arnulf of Carinthia. Arnulf was a capable and formidable ruler of the German lands, a descendant of the old Carolingian line, with the strength to come down into Italy whenever he judged the moment right. Formosus appealed to him in secret, inviting him south to take the crown and to lift Rome and the Pope out of the grip of the Spoletans. It was a bold gamble and a genuinely dangerous one. The Pope was, in plain terms, inviting one great power to break another, staking the safety of his city and the prestige of his office on the fortunes of a foreign army marching over the mountains. Historians still weigh that decision two ways, some seeing a shrewd defender of the Church's liberty playing the only card he held, others seeing a man who had spent his whole life choosing sides and could no longer stop. Arnulf answered. He came down into Italy with his forces, and in a hard campaign he pressed forward. Through the resistance, over the roads, he came at last to Rome, and there, inside old St. Peter's, Formosus performed the single act that would harden Spoletan resentment into something permanent. He lifted the imperial crown and set it on the head of Arnulf, naming him emperor in place of the house that had held the title. With that gesture, the whole weight of the Church came down publicly on the side of the German king and against the family the Pope himself had crowned. He had chosen, and it was the kind of choice the abandoned side does not ever forgive. For a moment it must have looked as though the gamble had come off. Arnulf was crowned, his rivals were reeling, and the Pope had a powerful new protector standing between himself and the men who wished him gone. But fortune, which had played with Formosus his whole life, took one last turn. Arnulf, the great hope from the north, fell suddenly and seriously ill. Some whispered poison, others spoke of a stroke, a palsy, a body simply giving way. Whatever the truth, the new emperor could not press the advantage he had just won. He pulled back out of Italy and went home, and the German army went with him, and Rome was left uncovered, with the furious Spoletans still very much alive and still in the field. So Formosus, an old man near the end of his road, found himself in the worst position a pope could occupy. He had mortally offended the house of Spoleto by crowning their enemy, and the protector summoned to shield him had collapsed and gone. No one was left standing in front of him. He had played the great game of crowns and armies as boldly as any man of his century, and on the final throw the dice rolled against him. Not long after, in the spring of 896, Formosus died. By the standards of his age, it was a gentle ending, a natural death, an old man worn thin by a lifetime of struggle, slipping out of a world that had never once let him rest. He was buried with honour in St. Peter's, in the tomb of the popes, and for a little while it might have seemed the story was finished. Whatever his enemies thought of him, death had carried him beyond their reach. He had outlived exile, excommunication, war and intrigue, and he had died in his own bed, Pope of Rome. But the hatred he had raised did not go into the ground with him. It was awake, and it had gathered itself into one household, in the wounded pride of the family he had crowned and then discarded. The Spoletans had not forgotten, and among them was one person in particular, fierce, clever, and entirely unforgiving, who found the old man's death an insufficient answer. So we must turn now to that family, and to the remarkable woman at the heart of it. The House of Spoleto was one of the great noble dynasties of a fractured Italy, lords of a powerful central duchy, hungry for the highest crowns, slow to forgive anyone who stood in their way. Their quarrel with Formosus was not a passing disagreement over policy. To them it was betrayal of the most intimate and unpardonable kind. Guy had built those ambitions, clawing his way to the crown of Italy and then the imperial title, fully intending to hand the whole inheritance to his son. For a season it seemed to have worked. His boy Lambert had been raised beside him as co-emperor, precisely so the dignity would pass smoothly from father to son and become a family possession rather than a prize to be fought over again. The dynasty looked ready to dominate Italy and keep the papacy in comfortable service. Then Guy died, and the throne came to young Lambert. And it was in those uncertain months, with a boy emperor and a watching Rome, that Formosus made his turn toward Arnulf. To the Spoletans this was black treachery. They had been his patrons. He had set the crowns on their heads with his own hands. By the harsh arithmetic of the age, he owed them loyalty for the rest of his days. Instead, he had conspired to bring a foreign army over the Alps to break them, and had given the diadem to their enemy. In their eyes, Formosus was no mere political opponent. He was an oath-breaker who had turned the sacred authority of the Church into a weapon and used it against the family that lifted him. At the centre of that wounded pride stood a woman whose name deserves to be spoken aloud: Ageltrude. She was Guy's widow and Lambert's mother, and by every account a person of fierce intelligence and iron will. In an age when noble women usually worked their influence quietly from behind a curtain, Ageltrude used hers in the open and used it well. She was the guardian of her son's claims, the keeper of the family's ambitions, the living memory of everything they had suffered. More than anyone, it seems to have been Ageltrude who nursed the hatred of Formosus and kept feeding it until his death was no longer enough to satisfy it. She is worth pausing on because she is exactly the sort of figure the popular version of this story loses. The memory of the Cadaver Synod fixes on two popes, the shouting one and the silent one, as though the horror were a private quarrel between churchmen. But the engine driving it very probably sat outside the clergy altogether. The Spoletans had the soldiers to hold Rome whenever they cared to, and it was their pressure and their appetite for vengeance that made the trial of a dead man thinkable at all. Behind the robed figures in that Lateran hall stood the armed power of Spoleto, and behind that power stood the will of one woman who would not let go. Historians still divide over how much to lay at her feet, some casting her as the true author of the affair, others cautioning that she may simply have been the most visible person in a room full of frightened, ambitious men. Once Formosus was safely in his tomb, the Spoletans moved to close their hand around Rome again. Lambert and his mother meant to undo everything the old pope had done, to scrub his legacy from the record, and to make certain the See of St. Peter served their interests and nobody else's. For that they needed a pope of their own, a man who would condemn Formosus, annul his hostile acts, and bind the church tightly to the house of Spoleto. And in the confusion of the succession, after one brief, short-lived pope had come and gone, they found their man, or helped to place him where they needed him. His name was Stephen. It matters to see clearly what the trial of the corpse was at its root. It was Spoletan revenge, wearing the robes of a church council. The legal charges, all that careful talk of broken oaths and unlawful movements between sees, were the formal language in which the vengeance was conducted, correct grammar for an act with nothing correct about it. The engine underneath was the rage of a family who believed themselves betrayed, and the resolve of one woman who would not rest while her enemy's memory was still spoken of with honour. Formosus had escaped earthly justice by the simple trick of dying. Ageltrude and her son meant to reach past that and bring him back to answer anyway. There is something chillingly complete about the plan. Defeating Formosus was not enough. He had to be unmade. His crowning of Arnulf had to be wiped from the record so the diadem could return cleanly to Lambert's head. His ordinations had to be voided so the men he favoured could be pulled down and replaced with friends of Spoleto. His legitimacy itself had to be denied, so his whole reign could be treated as something that had never lawfully happened. The trial was the instrument built to accomplish all of it in a single afternoon. A total erasure of an enemy who had died before he could be punished. So the stage is very nearly set. We have the broken empire, the contested crown, the exposed papacy, the resilient and ambitious dead man, and the family who could not let him lie still. One piece remains. We have to meet the living pope at the centre of it, and understand who Stephen was, where he came from, and why he was willing to do a thing that would mark his name forever. Before we follow him into that hall, let us slow down and step out of the palaces for a while, into the ordinary streets, because the texture of daily life tells us as much about an age as any council or coronation ever will. The people who filled the markets and workshops of the 9th century lived in a world carefully divided by rank, and every rank had its own habits, its own cloth, its own bread. At the top stood the great men, the aristocracy and the senior clergy, though in Rome those two groups overlapped so heavily that the distinction often blurred. The noble families lived in fortified houses tucked among the ruins, sometimes building directly into what antiquity had left behind, a tower rising out of an old theatre, a hall fitted inside ancient walls, new life growing on the bones of the old. They wore fine wool, and the wealthiest wore silk carried west along the trade roads, dyed in colours the poor would never touch. Meat came to their tables often, roasted fowl and pork and game, with good wheat bread, cheese, eggs, and wine from their own vineyards in the hills. They kept armed men, rode horses, and carried themselves as the natural masters of the city. The high clergy lived much the same way. A bishop or cardinal deacon from an important family enjoyed spiritual rank and worldly comfort in equal measure, and saw no contradiction in it. Below them spread the broad middle of the city, the craftsmen and traders and minor clergy who kept the place running, bakers, smiths, leather workers, the boatmen who hauled goods up the Tiber, the merchants selling cloth and oil and salt in the markets. Their days were busy and their comforts modest. They wore plain wool tunics, undyed or dulled with cheap dye, belted at the waist, with a simple cloak against the cold, and rough shoes on their feet. Their food was bread above all, dark and heavy, eaten with cheese and beans and onions and garlic, and whatever the season gave up. Meat, an occasional luxury rather than an expectation. Fish came out of the river. Wine, thin and watered, came with nearly every meal. These were the people whose labour fed and clothed Rome, and whose temper, when it turned, could shake a pope on his throne. At the bottom were the poor, labourers, servants, beggars, the countless souls living a single bad week from hunger. They dressed in whatever came to hand, patched coarse cloth passed along until it fell apart, and ate what they were given or could find, mostly bread, grain porridge, the cheapest vegetables, meat a rare event attached to a feast day or an act of charity. The Church kept a great many of those people alive. The popes and the great basilicas gave out food and alms. The monasteries offered shelter and care, and in a city with no strong secular government to speak of, that charity was not a small or symbolic thing. For many it was the whole thin margin between surviving the winter and not. The year itself was shaped by the Church. The great feasts marked the calendar: Christmas, Easter, the days of the saints, breaking the long labour of ordinary life with colour and rest. On such days, even the poor might eat better, share in a distribution, and join the processions winding toward the great basilicas. Pilgrims from distant countries added movement and strangeness, filling the hostels, crowding the roads to the holy places, carrying news and coin from lands most Romans would never see. The veneration of relics sat at the centre of this world, and the tombs of the apostles and martyrs drew the faithful from across Europe. Hold on to that, because it tells you exactly how monstrous it would seem, later, to tear a pope out of his grave. Clothing did more than announce wealth. It announced role, and it did so with great precision. The clergy wore garments that marked them off from everyone else. The long robes, the particular vestments of the liturgy, the small signs of rank within the church. A bishop was known by his dress, a deacon by his, a humble parish priest by his plainer cloth. In a society with no printed records, no photographs, where most people had never learned to read, such visible signals carried enormous weight. You knew who a man was and how to speak to him, in part by looking at what hung from his shoulders. Which is exactly why the body of Formosus was dressed again in full papal vestments before it was carried into that hall. The garments announced his rank, and tearing them off him afterward would announce his ruin just as loudly. The houses of ordinary people were plain. Brick or stone lifted from something older, a few rooms, very little furniture. Fires for cooking and warmth filled the small spaces with smoke that never entirely left the walls. Water came up from the river or from the few surviving fountains, carried through the streets in jars. Sanitation was poor, and sickness a permanent lodger, especially in the crowded, low districts near the Tiber, which flooded with miserable regularity and left damp and rot and fever behind when the water went down. Lives were short by our reckoning, and death was familiar, a presence in every household rather than a rumour from elsewhere. And yet there was warmth in that life, and colour. Markets loud with bargaining, taverns where wine loosened the tongue, music and dancing when the feast days came round, the comfort of neighbours and kin in lanes narrow enough that everyone knew everyone else's sorrows. There were stories told by firelight, and the great, slow drama of the liturgy, the candles and the chant and the incense, which could lift even the poorest soul out of the grind for an hour and set it down somewhere larger. People loved and married and raised children and quarrelled and laughed, as people always have, in the shadow of ancient ruins and the towers of the great families. Hold that ordinary world in mind as we climb back into the high politics of our story, because everything the popes and dukes schemed at played out above these people's heads and yet rested on their shoulders. It was the anger of the Roman crowd, these same bakers and boatmen and washerwomen, that would one day decide the fate of Pope Stephen. The great men plotted in their halls, but the city had a voice, and when that voice rose in fury, even the mightiest had to stop and listen. We will hear it rise before the night is over. First, though, we must meet the man who provoked it. And here we meet one of the quiet frustrations of studying so distant an age. The early life of Stephen is dim to the point of darkness. The records tell us a great deal about what he did, and almost nothing about who he was before he did it. He walks onto the stage already a churchman of rank, his origins in shadow, his youth simply missing. We must build him from fragments and from the world that made him. We know he was a Roman, born in the city or close to it. We know he rose through the clergy in the ordinary way, serving in the offices that lead a man upward. We know he became a bishop, and here is the detail that turns the whole story strange. By the accounts that survive, the man who would one day condemn Formosus had himself been ordained a bishop by Formosus. Their careers were braided together. Stephen owed his episcopal rank, at least in part, to the hand of the very pope whose corpse he would drag into a courtroom. He was, in a real sense, Formosus's own creation. That is more than a grim curiosity. It sits at the centre of Stephen's predicament and of the terrible solution he reached for. If Formosus had been a true and lawful pope, then the bishopric he gave Stephen was valid and secure. But if, as the Spoletan party wished to insist, Formosus had never lawfully been pope at all, then everything he had ever done dissolved, including the ordination of Stephen himself. So Stephen held a peculiar, twisted stake in the question. To declare Formosus unlawful was, quietly, to saw through the branch he was sitting on. And yet every pressure bearing down on him pushed toward exactly that declaration. He was caught in a web woven partly by his masters and partly by his own past. What we can say with confidence is that Stephen was a man of the Spoletan party, or at least a man who served Spoletan interests when it counted. He came to the throne in 896, in the disorder that followed the death of Formosus and the reign of a successor who held the office a matter of days before dying himself. In that confusion, with Spoleto pressing hard on the city and Ageltrude and Lambert set on bending the church to their purposes, Stephen emerged as pope. Whether he believed in their cause or merely read the wind hardly changes the outcome. He owed his throne to the faction that hated Formosus, and they expected the debt to be paid. It would be too easy, though, to paint him as a puppet, a weak man doing as he was told. The fury he showed at the trial, the personal venom with which he is said to have addressed a corpse, suggests something beyond cold calculation. There may have been real hatred in it, real fear, real conviction tangled with the political necessity. Perhaps he carried old grievances no chronicle bothered to record. Perhaps he was frightened for his own legitimacy. Perhaps, like a great many people who do terrible things, he had talked himself into believing it was justice. We cannot read a man's heart across 1100 years. We can only watch what he did and wonder what it cost him. What we can see plainly is the impossible corner he stood in. He was Pope, holder of the most sacred office in the Western Church, and he was bound hand and foot by the powers that had lifted him there. The Spoletans wanted Formosus destroyed, his acts annulled, his legitimacy denied, so the imperial crown could go back to Lambert, and the church could be folded neatly into Spoletan service. They needed a pope who would carry that program through to the end. Stephen was that pope, and to refuse them would have meant risking his throne, and very probably his life, in a city where popes were murdered with dreadful regularity. To obey them meant committing an act so monstrous that it would darken his name for as long as the story was told. He obeyed, and in obeying, he reached for a remedy so extreme that every generation since has stared at it. He could have condemned the memory of Formosus in words alone, issued decrees, annulled the acts, moved on with the business of the church. Popes had denounced their predecessors before, and the world had gone on turning. But Stephen, or the powers behind him, wanted something more total, something theatrical, something that could not be argued with afterward. They wanted Formosus himself, in the body, brought before a council and judged, so that no living person could pretend the fall had been anything less than complete. So the order went out. Open the tomb in St. Peter's. Bring the dead pope to trial. Think about the men who had to carry that order out, going down into the tomb, lifting a body that had lain there the better part of a year, dressing it again in the robes of the office it had lost, carrying it through the streets to a hall of judgment, past doorways where people had knelt when this man passed in life. It must have filled even hard men with dread. In that age, the dead were held in deep and fearful respect. To disturb any grave was serious. To disturb the grave of a pope was to invite the anger of heaven. Yet it was done, on the command of a pope, to serve the vengeance of one family and the arithmetic of one crown. With that order, Stephen passed the point where a man can still turn back. Whatever he had been before, an able churchman, a creature of faction, a frightened man doing as he was told, from that moment he was permanently the pope who tried a corpse. The obscurity around his early life ends here, in the hard, clear light of the deed. We know him by it. It is nearly all we know him by. Before we step fully into that hall, though, we should linger on the strange, crowded months between the death of Formosus and the council itself, because they show exactly how unsteady the papal throne had become. Formosus died in the spring of 896, and in the short space before Stephen took a firm grip on power, the See of St. Peter changed hands with a speed that is almost dizzying to follow. The man who came immediately after was Boniface VI, whose reign is among the shortest and most shadowed in the whole history of the papacy. He held the office roughly a fortnight before he died. The sources say little, and what they say is uneasy. There are hints of a checkered past, of a man disciplined and stripped of clerical rank at some point before arriving, against all expectation, at the highest office in Christendom. Whatever the truth of him, he was gone almost as quickly as he came, a reign measured in days. The throne stood empty again, and the great powers circling Rome moved at once. Into this fresh vacancy the House of Spoleto pressed and secured the election of Stephen. The timing tells you everything. With Formosus in his tomb and the imperial question still raw, with Lambert and Ageltrude set on undoing the old pope's work, the moment was perfect for installing a man who would serve their purposes. Stephen did not arrive by calm and orderly succession. He was lifted up in the heat of a factional struggle by the party with the most to gain from the destruction of Formosus's memory. From his first morning as pope, his reign belonged to somebody else's agenda. It is worth feeling the air of the city in those months, because it shaped everything after. Rome was tense and frightened and split down the middle. The death of Formosus had not ended the conflict he embodied. It had only moved it. The men he favoured were suddenly exposed, their protector gone, their appointments suddenly worth questioning. The men who had opposed him could smell revenge and reward on the same wind. Spoletan power loomed over the walls, and everyone who had backed Arnulf and the German cause found they had chosen the losing side of an argument not yet finished with them. Everybody watched, and waited to see how far the new order meant to go. The new order, as it turned out, was prepared to go a very long way. The legitimacy of Formosus had become a live and dangerous question, and far too much hung from it. If he had been a true pope, his crowning of Arnulf carried real weight, and Lambert's imperial claim stood permanently humiliated by it. If he had been a true pope, every bishop and priest he ordained held office lawfully, and the whole network of his supporters remained legitimate and untouchable. To break the Formosan party completely, and to clear Arnulf's coronation out of Lambert's path, his enemies needed more than disapproval. They needed it established as law that Formosus had never been pope at all. That is the cold calculation underneath the trial. Condemn him, declare that he had held the papacy unlawfully, and several things fall at once. The coronation of Arnulf dissolves, and Lambert stands as the rightful emperor. The ordinations dissolve, and the men Formosus promoted can be pulled out of their offices and replaced with friends of the new regime. And the legitimacy of his entire reign dissolves with them, every act treated as though it had never lawfully occurred. A sweeping program of demolition, and the trial of the corpse was the machine built to carry it out. There is a chilling cleverness in the choice of method. A decree of condemnation issued by Stephen on his own authority could be disputed, ignored, or overturned by whoever came next. But a formal trial, held before a synod of bishops, with the accused present in the room and condemned by due process, carried a weight that no private decree ever could, at least in appearance. By walking through the motions of a proper legal proceeding, the Spoletan faction meant to lend their revenge the dignity and the authority of a church council. And the corpse, ghastly as it was, served that purpose exactly. The accused was present. He could be judged in the body, as any man would be. The proceeding could therefore claim to be a real trial, rather than a piece of theatrical spite. It was, of course, a hideous mockery of justice, and a good many compelled to sit through it must have known it. The bishops summoned to that council were not free agents weighing evidence in good conscience. They were men under enormous pressure, in a city held by a vengeful faction with soldiers at its back, asked to condemn a dead man whose guilt had been settled before anyone entered the room. Refusing meant provoking the powers that ruled Rome. Complying meant sharing in something that violated every instinct of reverence they had been raised inside. Most complied, and then lived with it. So the pieces settled into place. A dead pope whose legitimacy had become a liability. A living pope installed by the faction that needed him condemned. A city cowed and watched over by armed men. A network of supporters to be broken, a network of enemies to be rewarded. And a method, monstrous but efficient, that would achieve all of it at one stroke, while wearing the mask of lawful procedure. The order was given. The tomb was opened. The body was carried into the hall. And so we arrive, at last, where we began. The lamps are burning, the bishops are seated, the dead man is propped in the chair of the accused. Let us look carefully now at what happened there, because it is the dark heart of everything, and it deserves to be understood not as a vague horror, but as a sequence of deliberate acts, each one chosen. The body had been lifted from its tomb in St. Peter's and dressed again in the full vestments of the papal office. That was no oversight, no strange courtesy. The robes were essential to the drama. The charges turned on whether Formosus had any right to that office at all. So to try him as a pope, they first had to present him as one, clothed in the very dignity they meant to tear away. The decaying figure sat there in its rich garments, the pallium across its shoulders, a dreadful parody of the man who had once filled them. Behind the chair crouched the deacon chosen to answer for him. A young clergyman handed the task of speaking in a dead pope's voice, in front of the assembled leadership of his own church. Stephen presided, and by every account his manner had nothing judicial about it. He was prosecutor and judge at once, flinging accusations at the silent figure with a passion that frightened the men watching. He demanded to know how Formosus had dared reach for the papacy. He charged him with ambition, with perjury, with trampling the sacred laws of the church. And above all he returned, again and again, to the old wound that had followed Formosus his whole life. That he had unlawfully moved from one see to another, that having been Bishop of Porto, having sworn under oath to renounce his office, he had never possessed the smallest right to the throne of Rome. In Stephen's telling, every single step of that long, remarkable rise had been a crime. The legal substance rested on 2 points of canon law. The ancient rule against a bishop deserting his see was invoked to argue that the Bishop of Porto could never lawfully have become Bishop of Rome, which is to say Pope. And the old disgrace under John VIII, when he had surrendered his office and sworn never to resume it, was dragged into the lamplight as proof of broken oaths. Stitched together, the charges pointed to one sweeping conclusion. Formosus had been a usurper, a false pope, his entire reign null, void, legally non-existent. The deacon offered such denials and defences as he dared. The outcome had been decided before the tomb was ever opened. Try to imagine the scene as the men in that room experienced it, because the surviving accounts make plain that it horrified even the hardened among them. This was an institution that wrapped death in reverence. It venerated the relics of saints. It held tombs to be sacred ground. To disturb a grave was fearful in itself, and to disturb the grave of a pope, to haul his decaying body into a courtroom and shout abuse at it, struck at the foundation of everything these men believed about the dead and about God. Many of those bishops sat there in real dread, afraid of the earthly powers that had dragged them in, and rather more afraid of what heaven was making of it. There is something nearly unbearable in the picture of that crouching deacon, murmuring answers in a dead man's voice. It fixes the event in the mind far more sharply than any list of charges. One frightened young man impersonating a corpse, in a trial whose verdict was already written, surrounded by bishops who did not dare look up, presided over by a furious pope, and all of it conducted with the outward solemnity of a sacred proceeding. That gap between the dignity of the forms and the obscenity of the substance is what has kept the Cadaver Synod alive in the memory for 11 centuries. It was barbarism, wearing the robes of law. What drove Stephen to such an extremity? We have seen the political arithmetic, the Spoletan demand for total erasure, but the personal heat of his conduct suggests something working underneath the policy. Fear, perhaps, for his own legitimacy, since his episcopal rank traced back to the very hand he was condemning. Hatred, perhaps, grown from old rivalries no chronicle preserved. or the peculiar fury of a man who has committed himself to a terrible course and can only live with himself by believing, with everything he has, in the guilt of the man he is destroying? Whatever the mixture in him, Stephen did not simply walk through the motions. He threw himself into the part of accuser with a vehemence that appalled the people who saw it, and that has gone on echoing ever since. The verdict, when it came, was exactly what the whole apparatus had been built to produce. Formosus was found guilty. He was declared unworthy of the pontificate, a usurper who had held the office unlawfully. His election was pronounced null and void, and with it every official act of his reign. The condemnation reached backward and undid everything. The coronations, the ordinations, the whole long legacy of his years on the throne. In the eyes of that council, the dead man was stripped of the very office whose robes still hung on his shoulders. But a verdict written on parchment was not enough for the fury that had summoned this council into being. The condemnation had to be made visible, physical, irreversible, written not merely into the records, but onto the body of the accused. With the verdict spoken, the assembly turned from judgment to punishment, and it is here that the horror of the Cadaver Synod reached its full height. It was not sufficient that Formosus had been named a false pope. His disgrace had to be enacted upon him, so that nobody anywhere could doubt how complete his fall had been. First, the symbols of the office were taken back. The rich vestments in which the body had been dressed for the trial were pulled away, and the act of removal was itself the statement. The dignity these garments carried had been withdrawn. The figure presented as a pope to be judged was now to be displayed as no pope at all, only a condemned and unworthy man. The robes that had marked his rank in life and in death came off, and with them, in the minds of his enemies, the last thread of his legitimacy. Then came the mutilation that has haunted the memory of this event ever since. The 3 fingers of the right hand, the fingers a pope raises to give his blessing, the fingers with which Formosus had blessed and consecrated and crowned through all the years of his reign, were cut from the corpse. The symbolism was chosen with care. By severing them, his enemies struck at the gestures of papal authority themselves, declaring that his blessings had been empty, his consecrations false, that the hand which made them had never possessed the right. It was a desecration aimed with precision at the sacred functions of an office they insisted he had never truly held. What happened to the body afterward varies a little from account to account, but the shape of it is grimly consistent. Stripped and mutilated, the corpse was first reburied, thrown into a common grave among ordinary dead, rather than return to the tomb of the popes it had been taken from. Even that was not the end. By the surviving accounts, the body was disturbed once more, dug up a second time, and finally thrown into the Tiber, the same river that carried the city's refuse away toward the sea. The man who had been pope, who had been laid to rest with honour in St. Peter's, ended in the brown current of that river, discarded like something unclean. And then comes one of the most famous and most tender traditions in the whole story. Whether every detail of it is literally true hardly matters, because of what it tells us about the people who repeated it. The story goes that the body of Formosus, carried downstream, was caught and recovered by someone, a hermit perhaps, or a sympathetic monk, and that from that moment it began to be treated with reverence rather than contempt. Tales spread that the corpse worked miracles, that it was honoured precisely where the council had intended it to be despised. Whether or not any of that happened, the spreading of such stories tells us something that no official record does. Ordinary feeling in Rome was turning, quietly and steadily, against the men who had done this thing, and toward the dead man they had abused. Beneath the surface of a cowed and occupied city, revulsion was rising. The forms of law had all been observed. The council had returned its verdict. Spoleto had had its way in every particular. But the deed had struck something deep in the religious instinct of the age. the reverence owed to the dead, the sacredness of the papal office, and the plain human horror at a violated grave and a mutilated body. People had obeyed out of fear. They had not approved. And as the shock wore off, that buried disapproval began to move. Then nature itself, or so it seemed to the people living through it, added its voice. Not long after the synod, an earthquake struck Rome, and in the shaking, part of the old Lateran basilica, the very complex bound up with the seat of papal authority, was damaged or brought down. To the medieval mind, trained to read the events of the world as signs of the divine will, this was not a matter of geology. It was a verdict. Heaven had waited, and then heaven had answered, shaking the ground beneath the place where a dead man had been condemned. The omen poured into the rising tide of anger against Stephen and everyone who had sat in that hall with him. We should not be too quick to smile at them for reading the earth that way. They lived in a world where the line between the natural and the divine was never drawn sharply, where great events were expected to carry meaning, and where the deepest moral judgments of a society found their expression in exactly such signs. The tremor gave shape and voice to a disgust that was already there. It let people say, in the only language they had for saying it, that what had been done was an offence not merely against a dead man, but against God. And once that feeling took hold, the ground under Pope Stephen became very thin indeed. He had overreached. In his own fury, or in the service of somebody else's, he had done a thing so extreme that it turned the moral sense of his own city against him. He had won his case against a corpse. In winning it, he had lost the only thing that actually held a pope in place, the willingness of Rome to accept him as its shepherd. The same city that had watched the trial in frightened silence was beginning to seethe, and the faction that had raised him could shield him only so far from an outraged population. In a place where popes were made and unmade by the temper of the crowd and the calculations of the powerful, that kind of anger was the deadliest thing in the world. The instrument of Spoletan vengeance was about to learn that vengeance turns in the hand. His fall came quickly, and it was as violent as the deed that caused it. The trial had been designed to secure his faction's triumph and finish his enemies for good. Instead, it undid him, because he had badly misjudged how deep the horror would run and how fast the mood of a city can turn. The revulsion that had been gathering under the surface broke into the open. The people of Rome, who carried reverence for the papal office and for the dead somewhere in their bones, could not in the end swallow what had been done. The stories of miracles gathering around the abused body, the dread that followed the earthquake and the wounded Lateran, the plain accumulating sense that a monstrous wrong had been committed in their name. All of it fed an anger no faction could keep a lid on. The city that had watched the synod in cowed silence found its voice, and its voice was against Stephen. To understand what happened next, remember how power actually worked in that Rome. A pope ruled by legitimacy and by force together, and his legitimacy rested in large part on the acceptance of the clergy and the people. When that acceptance collapsed, when a city decided its pope was a monster rather than a shepherd, his position became impossible. And Roman politics had a brutal directness to them. A pope who had lost the city was not eased quietly into retirement somewhere pleasant. He was seized, deposed, and destroyed. The same factional violence that had lifted Stephen was perfectly capable of pulling him down, and now it turned toward him. The larger winds may have shifted too. The great factions never held their advantage for long, and the Spoletan grip on Rome that had made the trial possible could loosen as rivals stirred and the local balance moved. Whatever the exact mixture of popular fury and political realignment, the outcome was not in doubt. An uprising came. Stephen was overthrown. The Pope who had presided over the Cadaver Synod was seized by his enemies and stripped of the very office in whose name he had committed his crime. His end matched the age that produced him. After his deposition, he was thrown into prison, and the papal robes were torn from him as he had torn them from the corpse of Formosus. It is a symmetry too exact for the people of the time to have missed. And there, in a cell, in the summer of 897, only months after the trial that had made his name a byword, he was strangled. The man who had hauled a dead pope into a courtroom to be condemned and mutilated was himself killed in confinement, in the dark, with no one to speak for him either. The wheel of violence that turned so relentlessly in that city had come the whole way round and crushed him in its turning. It is worth pausing on how fast all of this happened. Formosus died in the spring of 896. The trial of his body took place at the beginning of 897, and by the summer of that same year, Stephen was deposed and dead. In little more than a single turn of the seasons, the throne of St. Peter had held Formosus, then the brief and shadowy Boniface, then Stephen, with the grotesque drama of the synod crammed into the middle of it. The papacy in these years was a blur of short reigns and violent endings, a chair men killed to reach and died to keep. Stephen's entire pontificate, the crime and the punishment together, fitted inside one turbulent year. The justice that fell on him was rough and lawless. It was the verdict of an angry city, not of any proper court. There was no synod to weigh his deeds, no careful hearing of the case against him, only deposition and murder arriving one after the other. In that sense, his end was as irregular as the proceeding he had inflicted on Formosus. Rome in that age did not deal in measured justice. It dealt in faction, fury, and the cord. Stephen had risen through that system, and he died inside it, pulled down by rage he had raised himself. There is a hard, unsentimental symmetry in his fate, and the people of the time, reading the world for signs, did not fail to notice it. And yet his death settled nothing about Formosus. Nothing at all. The condemnations still stood in the records of the Church. The ordinations were still annulled. The legitimacy was still denied. Every great question the trial had opened remained open and bitterly contested. Stephen was gone, but the wound he had cut into the Church stayed, and it would fester and reopen in the years to come, because the trial of the corpse had set in motion a conflict that outlived every man who had begun it. A quarrel over the memory of a dead man that would go on dividing the papacy for years and would produce reversals every bit as dizzying as the original crime. So Stephen's death was not an ending. It was a hinge. It removed the man without undoing the deed or answering a single one of the questions the deed had raised. The Church was left holding the thing that had been done in its name, and had to decide whether the condemnation of Formosus would stand or fall, and what to make of the precedent that had been set. In the years after that strangling, the papacy swung back and forth on those questions, with an instability that shows exactly how badly the affair had shaken it. The first movement was toward repair. The popes who followed Stephen, conscious of the horror the synod had caused and anxious to restore some dignity to the office, set about reversing what had been done. A pope named Theodore II, who reigned only briefly, took up the cause of the abused dead man. He had the body of Formosus, recovered from the river, brought back with honour and buried again in St. Peter's, returned to the resting place it had been torn out of. The vestments and the dignity that had been stripped away were, in effect, given back. The disgrace pronounced by the synod began to lift. The work went further under a more substantial successor, Pope John IX. He called synods of his own, councils that formally annulled the proceedings of the Cadaver Synod and restored the legitimacy of Formosus and of the acts of his reign. The ordinations Stephen's council had voided were affirmed once more, so that the men Formosus had ordained could hold their offices in peace and stop wondering each morning whether they were priests. And to make sure the horror could never be repeated, John is said to have ruled that no dead person should ever again be put on trial in such a way. that such a rule had to be written down at all tells you how deeply the Church had been scandalized by its own conduct. The records of the synod were ordered destroyed, an attempt, in the plainest terms, to make the thing unhappen. For a while it seemed the wrong had been righted. Formosus vindicated, his enemies repudiated, the dignity of the papacy patched back together. But the factional struggles that had produced the trial were still very much alive, and the question of Formosus stayed tangled up in them. The legitimacy of his ordinations in particular carried enormous practical weight, because it determined the standing of an entire network of clergy, their livings, their authority, their futures. As long as the great families of Rome went on fighting each other, the dead pope's memory remained a weapon lying within reach of whoever wanted it next. And some years later, someone did. A pope named Sergius III came to the throne, a man of the opposite party, hostile to everything Formosus had stood for. Under Sergius, astonishingly, the condemnation was revived. The rehabilitations of Theodore and John were challenged. The old charges were affirmed all over again. The legitimacy of Formosus and of his ordinations was thrown back into doubt. Sergius is even said to have spoken approvingly of Stephen and of the original synod, which reopened every wound the intervening popes had worked to close. More than a decade after his death, the old man was condemned a second time, and the clergy he had ordained were pushed back into uncertainty. That dizzying sequence, condemnation, rehabilitation, condemnation again, tells us more about the state of the papacy than any chronicle could. The most sacred office in the Western Church had become so entangled with faction and grievance that the legitimacy of a pope could be reversed and reasserted as the political tide came in and went out. Whether Formosus had been a true pope was not settled by careful theological reflection. It was settled and settled again by whichever party happened to hold the city that year. It was a low point, very possibly the low point in the long history of the Roman Church, an age when the throne of St. Peter seemed to have slipped its moorings entirely. Eventually the matter was allowed to rest. The judgment of history came down, more or less, on the side of Formosus, and against the council that had condemned him. The Cadaver Synod is remembered now as what it was, a shameful aberration, a spasm of madness and cruelty that the Church itself came to repudiate. Formosus was left in his honoured grave. The strange trial of his corpse passed into the long catalogue of the papacy's darkest episodes, told ever afterward as a warning of what happens when sacred authority is captured by worldly hatred. So what are we to make of all of it at the end? It would be easy to keep the Cadaver Synod as a curiosity, a ghoulish anecdote to be produced for its shock value and put away again. But it is more than that. It is a window into an entire age. The troubled close of the 9th century, when the collapse of Charlemagne's empire had left Italy without a centre, when the papacy had become a prize contested by armed families, and when the highest office in Christendom could be picked up and used as an instrument of the lowest possible revenge. The trial was extreme. The conditions that produced it were ordinary in that time and place. It grew out of a world that had lost its balance and turned upon itself. And there is a quieter lesson in what became of the men involved. Stephen, who staged the trial, was strangled within months, his name blackened past all cleaning by the single thing he did. Formosus, the abused and mutilated victim, was carried back to his tomb, rehabilitated, and remembered afterward with sympathy by people who had never met him. The vengeance of Spoleto, so complete in its design, so carefully engineered to leave nothing standing, recoiled upon the hands that built it. The dead pope they had set out to erase outlived their fury entirely, and outlives it still, because you have spent this night listening to his story and not to theirs. There is something fitting in that. A reminder that cruelty, even when it wins the season, tends to hand down its own verdict on the people who practice it, and that the judgment of later ages is a slower court, but a surer one. It is strange to think how thoroughly the effort failed on its own terms. Every single thing the trial was built to accomplish came undone. The coronation it dissolved was dissolved again. The ordinations it voided were restored, then questioned, then quietly left alone. The records it produced were burned by order of a later pope who wanted the whole memory gone. And yet the one thing nobody could destroy was the story itself, which slipped out of the burned parchment and into the mouths of ordinary people, and has been travelling ever since, from chronicle to chronicle, from century to century, all the way down into this room tonight. Ageltrude wanted her enemy forgotten. Instead, she gave him the one form of immortality that cannot be revoked. Spare a thought, too, for the young deacon crouched behind that chair. He is the only one of them who wanted nothing, who gained nothing, who simply did as he was told in a room full of frightened men. Nobody wrote his name. He is the small human hinge on which the whole grotesque machine turned, and history let him go without a word. Perhaps that is its own kind of mercy. So we leave them now. The angry pope and the silent corpse. The unforgiving family and the bishops who did not dare look up. The shrunken city among its ruins, with its sheep grazing in the old forum, and its marble quietly disappearing into new walls, and the broken empire lying beyond it in pieces no one could gather up again. Their quarrels were fierce enough to kill for, and deadly enough to die for, and every one of them has faded now into the long quiet of history, where all quarrels eventually go. The lamps in that draughty hall have burned out at last. The river has carried away what it carried away, and long since forgotten it. The strange, sad story of the synod of the corpse rests where all such stories rest, in the still and patient keeping of the past. And nothing in it can reach you here. And so, as our tale comes gently to its close, let your thoughts slow with it. There is nothing left in these old shadows to be afraid of. Only pages turning, long after everyone in them has laid their burdens down. 1100 years have passed over that hall. The stone has settled. The dust has settled. Everyone in the room, the accusers and the accused, the frightened and the furious, has been at peace far longer than they were ever awake. If you are still with me and have followed this long road all the way to its end, there is another journey waiting on the screen whenever you want it. No hurry at all. It will keep. And if this one kept you company, you are always welcome to like, to subscribe, or to leave a gentle word below for the next traveller who cannot sleep, so they know a lamp is burning somewhere for them too. But for now, let all of that wait. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let your shoulders soften into whatever is holding you. Let the breath come slow and slower, and find its own quiet rhythm without any help from you at all. There is nothing to decide tonight, nothing to carry, nothing to hold. Let the old city drift away into the dark, the lamps, the robes, the river, the ruins, all of it dissolving softly, the way a lit window fades behind you on a long walk home. Let the voices go quiet. Let the story close itself. Rest now. Good night, and sweet dreams.